then if you want to use the lectern, that's fine, and then whatever, but I'll get Carrie up here. Carrie? So I'm just going to do a wee bit of housekeeping and then hand over to you. Okay. Cool. Kia ora tātou. So welcome back to day 2 of ATEPS, to our virtual audience and to all of you here. I hope you enjoyed the reception last night. I know we did, and it was really lovely to see so much networking going on after such a busy day. But today we're going to work you even harder. We're going from now through till 4 o'clock with very rapid breaks and some short lunch time and so on. So don't be afraid to work hard, and please don't be shy to ask questions. We really want to hear from you. As yesterday, this is the housekeeping. The bathrooms are that way for those of you who weren't here yesterday. If there's a need to evacuate, you pop outside to Wynyard Street, and just remember that there's no eating or drinking in the area of the tiles outside here. Just a reminder to all of you speakers and chairs that we need to keep very closely to time, because we are on a virtual platform as well as real time, which means that we just have to keep to time. And the agenda for today is as follows. So we're starting off now, and I'm going to hand over to Carrie Stoddart-Smith in a minute to introduce our keynote for this morning, and we follow through as per the agenda there. But you've all got this on your app, so you should be fine. Kia ora, and I'll hand over to Carrie.
Morena tātou. Our first speaker today will take us through the work she's been leading as the Principal Advisor for Māori Engagement for APEC 21, and the raft of exciting pieces of work that she's been leading and her team have been involved in to champion women's and Indigenous inclusion. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to my esteemed friend, colleague and mentor, Taria Tahana.
Tuatahi kei te mihi au ki ngā tangata whenua, ki ngā mana whenua, kia koutou Ngāti Whātua o Rākei. He mihi mai oha kia koutou mō tō mahi hei kaitiaki mō tātou mō tēnei rohe o Tāmaki Makaurau. Kia koutou katoa nā kaiwhakarite, Jennifer Ma, tēnei rātou ko Carolyn, tēnei he mihi, he karanga kia kōrua mō tō pukumahi ki te whakakohi tātou ki tēnei huihuinga i tēnei rā. Kia koutou katoa, nā tangata kua hara mai ki te kōrero, ki te whakawhiti whakaaro, tēnei te mihi mai oha kia koutou i tō tainga mai i tēnei rā, te rā whakatā mō te katoa, engari kei konei koutou e whakarongo ana ki tēnei kōrero. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Ko waia hau, ko mata whaura te maunga, roto iti te roto, Ngāti Piki ao te iwi. Ko au, ko Taria Tahana, ko taku mahi i Manatū Aorere, ko au te tumu whakarai mō APEC. Nō reira, nāku te honore, kia tai mai tēnei rā ki te kōrero kia koutou. So just want to say a very warm welcome to you all this morning. It's such a privilege to be able to be here in person to kōrero about this work, knowing that for many of our friends in other parts of the world, the opportunity to come together is something that they have been unable to do for many, many months. So I wanted to talk today and build on some of the kōrero that you would have heard yesterday. There's a little sort of saying that we have te materei whakaoho taniwha. And that's about the tohunga's staff as a carver that slowly etches in this picture of a taniwha. And for me, I feel that that's sort of very apt for where we are at as Māori and the mahi that we're doing in terms of trade policy. Today you're going to hear from many specialists, academics, people who are far more eloquent than me, talking about their various kaupapa. What I want to do is talk about really inclusion and action and my experience that I've had in the sort of 6 short years that I've been a public servant. So, you know, when we talk about trade policy and we talk about multilateralism and plurilateralism and bilateralism, when we talk about regional architecture and arrangements like APEC and negotiating free trade agreements, when I talk to these sort of things about my kids, they wonder what planet I'm on, and it all doesn't make a lot of sense. So the perspective that I sort of want to give, and I suppose where I come from is really how do we as government officials and the work that we do and the policies that we develop ensure that they are sustainable, they are progressive, they are inclusive, and that we all benefit from trade. And so what I want to do in the short time I have with you this morning is just share a little about the roles that I've had, the insights and challenges that I've seen, and the way in which I feel that we have been trying to make change in the public service to ensure that our efforts do benefit communities. So I suppose I'll make the point by just starting that I didn't start my career as a diplomat or as a trade policy specialist, like many of my colleagues that I work with. Like them, though, I did begin with an intention to serve, and that was very much to serve Māori, to grow our asset base, and to create a better future for our people. I come from Rotoiti, a small community on the shores of Lake Rotorua, or Lake Rotoiti rather. We're still a very strong, culturally rich community. We have 13 marae around just Lake Rotoiti, but we are fiscally poor. Our average income in the 2019 census was $22,600. And I don't know about you, but I know I certainly would struggle to live on that amount of money. So, you know, the issues are real, and for me, in developing trade policies, you know, it isn't about the free trade agreements, it isn't about the submissions and cabinet papers, or even so much exports to the world. It's about how we trade, who we trade with, and how the actual work that we're doing can change the lives of our community. And sometimes for me, the connection between my work and my community, I'm a commuter, so I go back to Rotorua every week, is really hard to see. And I'd say that my work in inclusive trade feels a lot like water dripping on stone. It is, in the words of the Chinese, it does feel like a journey of 1,000 miles. But I hope that in sharing my experience, that you will see that, like me, I do believe in a short period of time, you can actually make quite a significant difference, that you actually can cut a new path and you can forge new ways of doing things. And like many of you, I consider that I build on the work of many of those that have come before me, even here at Auckland University. You know, I think about my father, who was the first of his 16 siblings to come here to Auckland University and get a master's in education. And so as somebody that is working within the system, I sort of consider myself a bit of an architect and a layer of infrastructure. When I think about the work that I do in terms of trade policy, I think about myself as someone who's trying to create a highway and build greater international connections and develop the mechanisms that my children and future generations will pick up and actually take forward. Because already we see that there's not enough Māori businesses around creating employment and trading overseas to make that difference in our community. But as we diversify our economic interests, and as we grow our talent, things will change. And I think it's a very exciting future that we currently have. So I've been in the public sector for 6 years. Before that, I'd had a career in the private sector and also working for iwi. And so I think I came into the public service with quite a wide, diverse range of experience, working internationally as well as working within the community in a post-treaty settlement environment. So I've had 2 jobs since I've been in the public service. The first was as a policy manager for economic wealth at Te Puni Kōkiri. And that role was very much at the interface of domestic and international policy. So there I was responsible for He Kaikakuringa, the Māori Economic Development Strategy, and also the international strategy, which now is sort of more commonly known as Aotearoa ki te ao, that Minister Mahuta advanced last year. And in that time, I had some really interesting experience at Te Puni Kōkiri, leading, and I heard one of my fellow MFAC colleagues talking about the Untitled Chapter 19 Indigenous free trade agreement that we have with Chinese Taipei, and was fortunate enough in my 4 years at Te Puni Kōkiri to be able to build that relationship with Taiwan. I also got the opportunity to lead one of the delegations up to the Permanent Forum, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And at my time at Te Puni Kōkiri, we had 4 trade missions to China, Japan, Korea, Malaysia and Singapore. And were able to work on establishing in the margins of an existing Indigenous Business Forum, the World Indigenous Business Forum, a Rotorua group called that consists of Canada, Australia, Mexico and Chile. And with all of that experience, and after going to the Permanent Forum and being really excited by it, but realising that actually the focus of it was quite different to trade policy and economic interests, I moved over to MFAT to take on the role as the principal advisor responsible for the Māori program within APEC. And so I just want to share in terms of that journey, some of the insights and some of the challenges, because I realise some of my colleagues who are very involved in APEC are here, kia ora Veronica, Rob, but also many of you are at the beginning of your careers, and so hopefully these insights might be of interest to you. So I think just in terms of the insights, I talked a little bit about knowing who you serve, and so constantly for me, when I'm looking at trade policy or things that we're doing, the question that I ask is, what will Māori think of what I'm doing? How does this make a difference for them? And, I think when I look at where we're at with APEC, so within APEC, we've got a work program that has 4 areas. And what we knew going into APEC is that Māori really didn't know, or still don't know a lot about APEC and how it's relevant to them. That they want us to ensure that the leverage we get out of all of the investment and all of the effort going into APEC also benefits them. And also within APEC and the large policy work that happens there, how can we ensure that Indigenous inclusion is a part of those discussions? And also, how do we ensure that Māori entities who want to trade with our Asia Pacific colleagues are actually able to do so? So we've got within the Māori Success Program for APEC, we've got 4 strands of work, and those strands are a virtual Māori experience. So this week we had a live pōhiri, and we're currently in the process of turning that into content that can be delivered next week when we start APEC. And Vangelis, who you'll hear from later today, is the SOM chair, and he will open that event. But it will start, the very first thing that will happen will be a karanga that will be virtually delivered, and then Te Atiawa, our local mana whenua, basically have done a virtual opening that we will play. So we are looking within this virtual environment, how do we ensure that those people that are part of APEC see Māori not only as the cultural characters we are, but also as the commercial traders and the dynamic business people that we are, with people like Rachel Tolele, who will lead the APEC Business Advisory Council. So we've been very strategic in the way that we have endeavoured to create a program that manages the tensions that we often find in the international space of Māori being quite far ahead of other Indigenous peoples in terms of their relationship with their governments, in terms of their diversity of trade. So how do we ensure with APEC, and that brings me to the second area, that the Indigenous connections that Māori are so hungry for us to advance are part of a program. So we have a program that is looking at, off the back of the Indigenous Trade and Inclusive group that has been formed in the margins of APEC, and the work that they have done recently on developing a trade and gender arrangement. That particular group consists of 3 progressive economies, which is Chile, Canada and New Zealand, who are looking at how they can be more inclusive in the activity that they do. And they have signed, they have an arrangement now in place that is a non-binding arrangement. We are now looking at taking those relationships and building on that in the margins of APEC to set up an Indigenous cooperation arrangement. And we've been able to do that very much because of the relationships that have been formed through the ITAG group. And with having APEC, really we're using that as a way of driving to a conclusion within the next year. So hopefully within our intention is that within the next year we will have an Indigenous cooperation arrangement in play. And there's real opportunities in that to look at how do we do that with Māori. You'll hear more today about Te Taumata and the relationship that they have. How can Māori be much more a part of that arrangement that we develop? And how do we, as New Zealand, who is quite a leader in this space, support and work with other economies that are committed to doing things for their Indigenous people? We're talking within APEC of a population of around about 260 million Indigenous people. So the scope and the scale of what's possible within APEC is quite significant. And then the last thing that we are really ensuring that we do is the communication and the outreach with our program. So if I just talk about partnership with Te Atiawa in developing this opening and taking tikanga into a virtual space, it has meant that we have to change the way we do things in MFAT, and that we have to go at the pace that iwi want to go at. And there have been occasions where very much, I would say, as the Māori team, we work as the interface between iwi, and we work at the interface between MFAT and what we need to do. So there have been times where we've said, well, actually we need to, let's change what we do and let's shorten it. So rather than have an opening and closing on the 3 days of APEC, let's just bookend it and do an opening and a closing. And let's just go back and tell mana whenua that that's what we're doing. And, I'm having to say, well, actually, that's not partnership. Partnership is we go back and say, for us, this is how we'd like to do it. What does that mean for you? And how together can we make this shorter because of the time challenges? And I think those are some of the tensions that you face when you're working at the interface and you're trying to do trade agreements and you're trying to move at pace. How do you make sure that you do accommodate all of the understandings? Because quite often, as the Crown, we're coming off a low trust base with our mana whenua colleagues. And they don't think about me as Taria or Taria as a Māori. They just often think about me as the Crown and their last experience that they've had with the Crown, which might be with Oranga Tamariki or might be with police. It's quite a different experience to dealing with me in the commercial space. And so, it's very important in those interactions that I also acknowledge that the whole that I represent as the Crown. So that was a long knowing who you serve, but it also is, I suppose, what makes it really exciting to know that there's mechanisms available that we can actually draw on. And I think when you look at Chapter 19 and the Free Trade Agreement and what it has been able to provide, I think if we looked at the way it was negotiated now, we'd say, well, that wasn't good enough and we want it done differently. And clearly going forward, things are being done differently. But it's a mechanism that's enabled us to establish a relationship with our colleagues in Taiwan. And you heard Rachel last night talk about Tina Wilson going up there as the Trade Commissioner. And that's really exciting. And I think that we will see, relationships grow and develop when we have Māoris on the ground there, understanding and seeing what those opportunities are. And for me, I had a colleague up there who was also Indigenous woman who led their delegation. And I think, like many of us Māori, we find that it's not, and I think our Pacific colleague yesterday talked about when Minister Mahuta goes into the Pacific, she won't be seen as Minister Mahuta. She will be seen as a descendant of Tawhiao from Waikato Tainui and all of that history that she brings as being part of the Kingitanga movement. And so for me, I wore this today because Aikuku, who was my counterpart and the director for the Council of Indigenous Peoples up there, when I said to her, oh, that's really beautiful, I love it, those colours are very similar to what we have for Māori, she said, here, have it, I want you to keep it. And so for me, those are the sort of connections we have. And every time there's someone from here goes up or she comes down, we kind of trade another thing that is like another connection that keeps those bonds between us alive. So when Tina goes up, I need to send something back up to my friend Aikuku, who's from the Amis tribe up there. And so those are the sort of relationships that I think become intergenerational, that as Indigenous people with whakapapa connections to many of these places, we see that we can build through our trade policy relationships. I think the other thing, that in terms of insights is the networks and the relationships, I think are really important. And those relationships, one of the things within APEC that there's clearly sensitivities amongst some of the 21 economies around Indigenous issues. So we've had to be very considered in the way that we have built a program of work, particularly within APEC, where you have to have consensus. And so last year I went up to Chile and spoke at, we had an opportunity to speak about the Māori experience, and we talked about the Māori economy and the journey that we've been on. And then we went from there, and we've built a project within APEC, which is called Measuring the Māori, or Measuring Indigenous Economies. And so we're looking at, in early March, convening a discussion, a policy dialogue within APEC around what is the state of Indigenous economies. And we've just got information back from the other economies, and you can see that they're in a very different position to that of New Zealand. But actually, if we start to understand the data in a way that's important to us, then actually we can start to get a sense of what actually is the potential of the 260 million people within APEC, Indigenous people. So, and just as a result of speaking at Chile, I was talking to my colleague around the Indigenous Cooperation Agreement. We've now got Chile and Canada to agree that they'll suspend their current negotiations, and they'll look to move this process into an APEC adjacent category. And my colleague was telling me yesterday, when they said that Taria was involved, that they felt much more comfortable about what we were doing as Indigenous people because they'd seen me talk at Chile, up in Chile. And so I think the point is these relationships count, and all of those interactions that you have build to your credibility and the relationships that you have when you're actually at the negotiation table trying to get a trade arrangement. And also, having been up to the Permanent Forum, and when we went up, we did a side event on Indigenous economies and talked a little about New Zealand experience. And it was the first time many of the other nations that were there said that they had had an economic conversation, that they were largely at the Permanent Forum talking about, issues of land. It was during the Dakota pipeline, so that was very topical. And that they actually hadn't had a lot of discussion around the potential of the economy. So that was where it really drew me to be part of APEC, which is very economically focused. And what we've already found with some of our economies is they say, oh no, take Indigenous issues back to the UN, it doesn't belong here in APEC. Having been there, I know it doesn't really belong there either. So, by having this experience, it gives you the kaha to know that you need to go forward. So I just wanted to touch on one last point because I can see that my time is up. And I think that the last point of my insight is that you need leadership. And, there's a couple of examples of leadership here around inclusion that I think are really important. I think that the first one is Vangelis. So Vangelis, this week we gave him a pounamu at the Pōhiri. And that pounamu, he said when he got that pounamu, it made him feel that he's taken on more responsibility in terms of his role as the chair of APEC. But in actual fact, that tohu is a tohu to him that as Māori, given all the work that he has done for our community around Y2522, setting up Te Taumata, setting up Ngā Toki whakarururanga, actually we support him. We are here to help him with that role that he has to play. And as he goes forward, and at the end of APEC, if he so chooses, that pounamu's his to give to whoever he wishes. So I think my point is, in the inclusion space, you need to find champions. And when you have champions like Vangelis, then you can actually do a lot. And that leads me to two other people, which is Jennifer and Carolyn. Last year, many of us came to this forum in its inaugural year. And when we were here, we passed on feedback that we didn't think that there was enough discussion about inclusion, that Māori weren't in the program. So I can see that when I look at the program now, that they have very much taken on that feedback. And if anything, the pendulum might have swung the other way, where people will go, wow. But that to me is inclusion in action, and that's what really excites me in the role that I have. And obviously, just the last point is I never would have thought that I would be working under a Māori minister as the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and what power that provides to people like me who have someone like her. So at that pōhiri earlier this week, when I said to her, Minister, I know this isn't scripted, but can we give this koha to Vangela? She said, "Kei te pai, Taria, tell me what to do." And I know if it wasn't a Māori minister, there is no way that we would have been able to do that, to honour Vangelis in the role, and he's got a very tough, challenging role ahead, but that's based on the work he's done before and he will do going forward. So, in closing, I think I just want to say, in the words of JFK in his inaugural speech, you know, this is about not ask what your country can do for you, but ask what can you do for your country. You know, I believe you all as people working in this space can make a big difference for New Zealand. And so I wish you well. We say kia kaha, kia maia, kia manawa nui. Be strong, be brave, and be big-hearted. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Awesome, thank you, Taria. That was really great insights. We're just going to move straight into our next panel that will speak to a topic that's very close to my heart, and as you just heard, to Taria's heart as well, Indigenous trade and the Māori economy. This is a policy area that's increasingly gaining traction across a range of MFAT and other public sector work streams, particularly with the recent appointment of the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta as Minister of Foreign Affairs and as the government advances its inclusive trade and economic recovery agenda. Joining us this morning, we have three experts across this incredibly broad kaupapa who will help us get a sense of the landscape, the opportunities and challenges of the legal and policy frameworks that impact Indigenous trade and the Māori economy. If you would all please join me in extending a warm welcome to Associate Professor Bargh from School of Māori Studies at the Victoria University of Wellington, Dr. Amokura, President of the New Zealand Law Commission, and Hone McGregor, Board Member of Te Taumata, the Trade for All Advisory Board, and Wakatu Incorporation, and Chair of our Land and Water Governance Group. Ho mai te pakipaki. I think it's going in order, so we'll start with you, Maria. Do you want to stand or do you want to?
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi tuatahi kia Ngāti Whātua, ngā maunga whakahirahira, e tū mai rā, me te moana e pō kare nei. Ki ngā kaiwhakahaere, tēnā koutou, ngā kai kōrero, huri noa kia tātou katoa, tēnā rā koutou. Well, kia ora everybody, lovely to be here. Hopefully you can see me in the dark lighting and over this lectern. I wanted to start with a vision. And my vision, which is not mine alone of course, is for Aotearoa New Zealand leading the world in sustainable, fair and tika international trade. And I think, as I said, this isn't my vision alone. Even before COVID, there was momentum internationally and nationally to acknowledge that our current and dominant economic and political policies are harming the planet and people, and that they really need to change. We can see from donut economics, of course, that's shown us where the safe and just space for humanity is, in between our basic needs in the middle of the donut and the planetary boundaries at the edge. We've got different UN conferences talking about fair and sustainable trade. The New Zealand government signed up to the Wellbeing Economy Governments Alliance. We have a number of banks internationally which were very interested in the idea of fair and sustainable trade. We have PwC and the World Wildlife Foundation, for example, putting out a report about nature being too big to fail. A whole lot of other banks talking about the material financial risks from climate change. So there's a lot of momentum here. Older sort of instruments, I guess, that we've had are Mātātua Declaration from back in 1993, the United League of Indigenous Nations Treaty from 2007. So we have a range of things that are building this momentum. So the part of the vision that I'd like to focus on in my very short time today is this tika trade aspect. Tika, of course, means correct or just or right, and with a suffix ngā, transforms it into a noun, denoting the system by which correctness, rightness, or justice is maintained. So as the first political institutions in Aotearoa, hapu and iwi were the first diplomats and treaty makers, with their own mana and whenua, producing their own goods, and they traded these with others. Capitalist and neoliberal trade agreements are not a contemporary expression of age-old trading routes, quite to the contrary. Māori politics and economics is based on tikanga Māori. The core principles of tikanga Māori are completely different from systems of government and principles of trade which have emerged from an English cultural context. Relationships are key, whanaungatanga, including between people and between people in the environment, mana rangatiratanga, kaitiakitanga, and so on, and utu, balance. Tikanga is becoming increasingly understood by non-Māori as a vital source of law in Aotearoa. Clearly, Māori knew that all along, but the New Zealand Law Society, those who are engaged in legal education in New Zealand, are now saying that actually judges and lawyers in this country shouldn't be able to practice without a deep understanding of te ao Māori and tikanga Māori as a source of law in this country. We look at local councils where there are planners and engineers who are also saying, actually, we need to know about kaitiakitanga and tikanga Māori also. As part of our Vision Mātauranga strategy, we have scientists and researchers who really aren't able to get funding anymore without acknowledging a te ao Māori view. Statistics New Zealand has a mana orite relationship with the iwi leaders data group, acknowledging the data and Māori data sovereignty is an issue to be addressed in a co-governance manner. So these are all elements of change that we can see. It follows, of course, that tikanga Māori, the rangatiratanga sphere, also needs to be reflected in the principles and processes of international trade agreements. So what would a tika trade look like? Well, it would be founded in tikanga Māori, uphold te tiriti obligations, such as partnership, active protection and reciprocity, and be consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this is our kind of vision, but what's standing in the way of that vision? Well, there are 5 elements that I've identified that are sort of top priorities. The first is that Māori are diverse, and Taria mentioned this earlier, and the Crown must work with a diverse range of Māori representatives. So we have some organisations that are enthused by particular sorts of trade, and we have a whole range of other Māori organisations that see risks and dangers. The lessons that we can draw from our domestic sphere are quite wide-ranging. We can see that the ideal ways for the Crown to accept Māori diversity are not in insisting on particular groupings, like large natural groupings which are very unnatural, in fact, to Māori. That sort of process that we see domestically has created a very adversarial and competitive situation amongst iwi with the treaty settlements process. The Waitangi Tribunal has said on numerous occasions that the Crown cannot pick favourites. They can't just pick groups to work with who are already aligned with their perspective. So in terms of informing MFAT's work, well, we can see that consideration should be given to genuinely listening to a broad range of Māori views, not simply Māori exporters. So here we can think of the likes of Te Mana Rāraunga, the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, Te Tera Whakamātaki, the Māori Biosecurity Network, Te Hungaroia, are some of the groups that we could think about in this context. The second element that I see standing in our way of a kind of tika trade arrangement is the Crown needs to actively protect Māori rights. Ko Aotearoa tēnei, of course, said that the current processes pursued at the moment around international instruments aren't treaty compliant. With each instrument that it signs up to, the Crown has less freedom in how it can provide for and protect Māori rights and tino rangatiratanga. The Crown's fettering, allowing for the fettering of New Zealand sovereignty without actually supporting Māori. They've never accepted, my colleague Carwyn Jones says, it's telling that the Crown's never accepted any equivalent binding obligations to comply with te tiriti. So we have seen some steps forward, and Taria spoke of some of these, and we'll hear about some of the others shortly. Treaty clauses, which are quite modest in scope, and leave it to the Crown to determine the measures they believe necessary to protect Māori rights. We have other lessons around this kind of area in the domestic sphere. When you look at what the Crown currently considers as good enough in terms of active protection of Māori rights, we can see we've still got a way to go. If you take freshwater ownership, for example, there's still quite a long way to go there. We have Te Taumata, which is enabling MFAT to have a different sort of vision about some of the interests they see as being affected. These are modest steps and need to be enhanced. And of course, Māori must have a really adequate say in identifying which are Māori interests and devising the protection for those rights. The third element that I see standing in our way is the Crown needs to provide resources for the treaty partner. And so again, we've seen this recommended by the Tribunal at a domestic level in terms of fresh water. The Crown must provide those resources to enable the treaty partner to participate adequately. Third, support Māori to uphold kaitiaki obligations. So Māori have demonstrated a significant interest in actively filling our kaitiaki obligations to taonga, the environment, biodiversity and intellectual property as per tino rangatiratanga guaranteed in Te Tiriti. Those rights and interests are significantly impacted by trade agreements. In other places, we can see the Department of Conservation and councils already embracing the idea of co-partnership, co-governance of these resources with Māori, and we need to see that extended to the international trade realm. So greater support and greater weight, of course, to kaitiaki concerns. The next element, I think, is reconciling all trade agreements with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Here we have a number of Indigenous scholars internationally who have talked about aligning and reconciling these two elements. While, of course, the declaration needs to be implemented domestically, there is an expectation, and this has been reiterated several times by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that states are taking active steps towards implementing the declaration. So what should happen now to advance tika trade? Well, the Crown can demonstrate good faith to Māori so that Māori have trust and confidence that the Crown's really worth being in a partnership with, and Taria, in fact, sort of suggested some of these. Treaty relationships require mutual recognition of coexistence of Crown and Māori, so your kāwanatanga and your rangatiratanga spheres, as valid forms of authority. In terms of practical steps, what are some other things? Agree to implement the tribunal recommendations from Ko Aotearoa Tēnei, from the TPPA report once it's completed. Action the action plan, he puapua, proposed by Clear Charters and others to implement the UNDRIP by 2040, and perhaps agree to a minimum of 5 years funding for representatives for Te Whakamātaki, Te Manararonga, Hungaroia and iwi chairs to analyse hapu and iwi Māori views which have already been provided to the Crown about trade, and have this as a report tabled with Cabinet and discussed publicly. So those are my ideas and my vision. Kia ora koutou.
Ai ngā mana o runga i te whenua nei, o ku whānau a Ngāti Whātua Rākei a tēnā koutou. Kia koutou katoa, hui mai nei i tēnei ata, tēnā tātou. Kia ora everybody, morena. So the first question I'm asking myself is, why am I here? The work that we're doing at the Law Commission covers a whole range of things, none of which touch on trade. So we're looking at using DNA in criminal proceedings, succession, class actions. I think I've been asked to speak today, though, because of my prior work in the Waitangi Tribunal. Some years ago, I was asked to assist the Tribunal in the Y2522 inquiry into the adequacy of the treaty exception. So I thought I'd just focus my remarks and include some reflections on that process. It was an opportunity, I think, for us to throw a critical lens over the status quo and question the underpinnings of our trade policy framework, and I guess also to confront some resistance to that questioning. So I just want to talk about a couple of things. New Zealand's defensive interests in terms of protecting domestic policy space in New Zealand through our trade agreements while also promoting trade. So that's not a trade question, it's how do we protect a general policy making space while at the same time trying to promote our trade interests. The second and related issue I just want to touch on concerns the political relationships between Māori and the Crown with respect to trade. As a lawyer, I am coming to this from a legal perspective, but I would say, again, as a lawyer, that the legal framework underpins our international relationships and trade. So first of all, the Treaty of Waitangi exception in free trade agreements, the Y2522 proceedings, to begin with, we focused on the adequacy of the so-called treaty exception that we've included in our trade agreements since 2001. At the time, the exception was unique. We were the only country including a general exception in our free trade agreements to allow the government to take into account and to pursue interests that would favour its Indigenous peoples. But it's also flawed. It's old text. It's not updated. It hasn't been updated despite significant developments in trade agreements. So you'd expect that as trade agreements expand in scope and start to cover a whole range of issues beyond simply trade in goods and services, that an exception which is intended to preserve policy space would also have to expand, because as the agreement expands in its scope, so does the need for the policy space to be protected also has to expand. The other issue, apart from being out of date with the treaty exception, is that it reduces the treaty relationship between Māori and the Crown to one of preferences. In other words, the exception permits positive discrimination. And anyone who knows anything about the Treaty of Waitangi knows that it is not about protecting preferences for Māori. It's a political relationship between Māori and the Crown. During the tribunal proceedings, the discussion was concerned with the effectiveness of the exception. And there was a degree, I think, of speculation about the kinds of issues that would have to be covered by the exception. It was quite a difficult exercise, and my colleague Jane Kelsey is here, and I think she'd probably agree that it was quite a difficult exercise to try and anticipate what kinds of things an exception would have to cover. The tribunal concluded that the treaty exception provided reasonable protection, and in that sense there was no breach of the Treaty of Waitangi. But the tribunal also accepted that the processes for engaging with Māori and reaching its decision to include the exception in its current form was flawed. So the adequacy of the treaty exception is still being debated in the ongoing aspects of that proceeding. And I think that in itself is becoming a problem in its own right. I think the Crown should be focused on engaging with Māori on the text and how it should be used. And again, that's not a trade question. One of the premises, I think, underlying the Crown's position is that in terms of international affairs, the Crown is sovereign and it represents New Zealand on international stages. And I would question whether that's an all that helpful position for us to keep on taking or thinking about, whether we should be thinking in different terms. And now if I just reflect on some of our recent experiences in the Law Commission, completely different context. We've just issued a report on using DNA in criminal proceedings, and we felt it's no longer useful for us to start by saying, well, the police obviously have the power to enforce laws and that the state has responsibility to pass criminal laws and to task the police to enforce them. We have massive overrepresentation of Māori in the criminal justice system, and we have massive overrepresentation of Māori in the collection of DNA. 15 to 16% of the population, 40 to 45% of Māori represented in the DNA databanks, and between 50 and 60%, depending on gender, in prison. So we had to think about, well, what is it about the original promise in Te Tiriti that might help us address these issues? How can we empower Māori and enable Māori to stand on our own feet rather than tasking the Crown with protecting our interests? So without going into that report, we've tried to reflect that thinking as much as we can in terms of trying to adjust the balance in that particular aspect of law enforcement. And I just wonder how much of that thinking needs to take place in the trade space also. Then I might just shift to more recent participation. I was, along with Hone, a member of the TFAB board, the Trade for All Advisory Board, which concluded end of last year. That process was mainly focused on offensive interests or promoting trade, but we also recognised in that process that trade policy has to have strong social foundations for it to be legitimate. Our recommendations included that trade should reflect and support the country's values. And I tautoko Kitty's comment earlier that we should be thinking about how this contributes to improving people's lives. We looked at adopting an anticipatory governance framework, including how Māori interests and values can become part of trade policy. Again, picking up on one of Maria's comments, using Māori frameworks for addressing outstanding issues, like how to implement the Waitangi Tribunal's recommendations in Y262, as well as a number of more practical steps, such as supporting the taumata, which Hone will speak about, I'm sure, Māori participation in delegations and recruitment, even within MFAT. So a whole range of issues there. Some of them are quite fundamental in terms of how do we actually think about the Crown-Māori relationship, what should that look like in trade, how should we disrupt current patterns of governance, and how do we implement them practically. Thank you.
Maranga, titiru atu ki waho kei te haere mai te awatia. Te hei Māori ora. Te mea tuatahi te whare tū nei, tēnā koe. Ki te mana whenua, Ngāti Whātua o Rākei, tēnā koe. Tēnā kōrua. Ki koutou kātoko, hui mai nei tēnei wā mō tēnei hui te kaupapa o trade, ko tēnei te kaupapa o te tūtake o tātou taniwhai tēnei rā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora koutou. My name's Hone McGregor, and thank you very much for this. We didn't coordinate our speeches, but weirdly, my speech basically covers everything that they covered. So, and I just said that to Maria, and she goes, oh, don't worry, underscore everything, that's fine. So that's great. I want to thank you all for turning up to this. I want to thank you all the newbies at Foreign Affairs and Trade for turning up to this, for turning up on Saturday morning. I hope you put in your toil claims to your managers and respective things for that. That's a good thing to do. I wanted to start off today as well with just a couple of thank yous. I want to say thank you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Manatu Aorere, for your support around kaupapa like this, and you'll hear a little bit more about your broadening support for things that are really stuff that relates to kaupapa Māori around trade. I want to especially thank Vangelis Vitalis, because your support around things has been really fantastic, and you've turned up to all the meetings that we've had around our stuff. Please continue to do that. When you're in the room, people take notice, I notice, so that's good. I want to thank the University of Auckland for hosting this event, because I think it's really great that we continue on some of these conversations. I'll have to read it without my glasses. And I want to thank your Public Policy Institute and Jenny for the kind invitation for me to participate in this as well. I am not an academic, unfortunately. But I did want to start off by posing a thought. And I was just thinking, kia ora, thanks Iho. Imagine an Aotearoa that is actually not colonised, or maybe a decolonised Aotearoa, because they are two different things, maybe as a starting point. And then if you layer on that the positives of globalisation and international trade, what then would Aotearoa's trade arrangements really look like? Maybe we'd consider our international relations, our engagement, our trade differently, through more than maybe some of these defensive, offensive, tactical lenses, and more through sovereignty and intergenerational lenses or kaupapa. Something like, you know, is this FTA, is this international instrument, is this IP protection mechanism, blah, 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 the things that we're sort of negotiating and signing up to, to borrow your term, is this tika? You know, is this right? Is this just? Is this fair? Is this pono? Which really means, is this honest or genuine? And has this been done with love, aroha, and due consideration? Like my cousin Rachel said yesterday, are we negotiating something where the outcome is that we're ensuring that we're going to be good ancestors for the future, applying this intergenerational kaupapa? Then, if we look at the reality of the now, if we think of the uncolonised, decolonised Aotearoa and the now, how far away are these two worldviews, the Māori and the non-Māori worldviews? Well, that's actually the kind of journey that we're on with regards to Te Taumata and the Federation of Māori Authorities and our engagement with Manatū Aorere MFAT. This lens, these values actually form the tikanga of our mahi around Te Taumata. And we, as Māori on Te Taumata, have been advocating for this, along with the recommendations that we had with the Trade for All Advisory Board as well. And it all fits broadly within this sort of kaupapa around the progressive trade agenda. In fact, the DNA of Te Taumata is in Trade for All. But we need to be able to really easily answer these fundamental questions about what is tika, what is pono, what is aroha, to ensure that we've got our question right, which is the Māori question, which is our why, the Māori why. And I was at an event and Trevor Moike from the New Zealand Treasury actually brought up this framework as well. And I thought that's great to hear the first things that come out of somebody from Treasury talk about a values, principles-based conversation. So why? Why as Māori are we entering into these partnerships with these other peoples, these other countries, these other cultures? Because from a tikanga-led trade agenda, it's not about economies to economies or trading blocks to trading blocks. It's about relationships between people. And that's what the Indigenous trade agenda would have at its heart. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. That's what we hope would come through as part of the Trade for All Advisory Board's recommendations. Our why have an Indigenous Māori trade strategy and the follow-on trade agreements and international instruments and relations that come from that? Well, that's because this strategy actually gives essence to inclusivity, diversity, and sustainability in trade, the kaupapa of this hui. From my engagements so far, which is only, so far we've just had 1 year on Te Taumata, I've had some fantastic engagements with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, incredibly candid, and I've noticed that a lot of effort goes into negotiating specific chapters, specific clauses in those chapters, dispute settlement arrangements. But what would a trade agreement based on principles and outcomes look like? I mean, it sounds a bit crazy, right? But in fact, what would a coalition of the willing look and operate like? For Māori, we believe that there is value in values and principles. Trade and trade agreements negotiated at the transactional level will only operate and endure at that level and not achieve being tika and pono and made with aroha. For Māori, the social license will more and more be about how does advancing more trade articulate to our intergenerational, our 500-year plans, not just about our next fiscal, electoral, or economic cycle. Having balanced trade that does not impair the environment or these constitutional arrangements and sovereignty or our rights and responsibilities for diversity and labour equity, society or culture, or change Aotearoa by stealth through the imposition of rules and regulations that really crowd out Indigenous trade. That balanced trade is our end goal. It is the end goal, and it is something that we think is the Māori why. But we recognise it's no mean feat. Trade is part, obviously, of the tapestry of society that threads together our economic, our cultural, physical, spiritual well-being. And it should preserve and, where possible, advance tino rangatiratanga, tangata ora, and te taiao. It should not be something that exploits, damages, or impairs these things for future generations. And for us, this is really the kaupapa of te taumata. It's not all about motherhood and apple pie. This is what we're striving to achieve, and as Māori, we have to evolve those connected narratives, and as Vangeli told us before, and also the evidence and data, as hapu, as iwi, as Māori businesses and corporations in partnership with government. It's about remembering our essential why, and then making sure that we as Māori can communicate from that why. That said, why is important, but we understand the what is important too, and these are exactly the same things that were brought up by the previous two speakers. We think the what really should include what part or role should culture play, especially as we look to advance trade and ideas and services and technology. What would this trade policy be that evolves firstly from a people lens? How would we incorporate our relationship with te taiao in terms of whakapapa, our whakapapa relationship with nature, versus only an extractive relationship with nature? Do trade relationships and activities speak directly to those specific outcomes we want in te taiao and te ao Māori? Are these outcomes the ones that ensure that we are being good ancestors? Tupuna pono. Then we layer on top of this our constitutional basis for our nation, te tiriti o Waitangi, and at te taumata we're asking ourselves, well, will trade policy arrangements advance the partnership contemplated in te tiriti? What are the current barriers identified to doing this? What part do the findings in the Waitangi Tribunal play in trade? What specific priorities would differ in a Māori trade strategy? We know that the devil's in the detail, and so we have to focus on what this looks like out of this, other than a theoretical abstraction around it, as a real-time action plan, and that's actually it's emerging for us. So you've got to give us a bit of time around this one. Us as Māori and our engagement around trade and policy, and us as te taumata and FOMA. So where to from here? I want to acknowledge MFAT's tautoko in the way that they've really looked to engage with us in this new modality, and also for the government to actually agreeing to take on board the platform of the Trade for All in terms of its recommendations. But I know that we still need to do some of those things like Y262 and Y2522. Things like, what does the Nagoya Protocol mean in terms of access and benefit sharing if we're going to move from volume to value? What does a national interest assessment analysis look like around Māori? What's an Indigenous chapter in an FTA and what should it contain? Determining the relevant cultural measures of a high quality, comprehensive trade strategy agreement and outcomes. I just want to finish on a couple of points here now. First thing is potential tension points moving forward for us. The thing for us is about the conversations we see coming forward is who should hold the pen around these strategies? And then how should it be commissioned and who should pay? What would an appropriate accountability mechanism look like? And then how should we report it back to tangata whenua, from which our mandate is assumed? That's our imprimata. Guiding us in this mahi will be whether we can say this is tika, this is pono, and this is done with aroha. And just a couple of warnings. Don't lose faith in the process with us. Don't lose will when this starts to get difficult or we reach difficult forks in the road. Keep heading in the same direction with us. That's what partnership is about. Fund us. Fund us and resource Māori appropriately to ensure we can engage in good faith and at the levels that we determine are necessary and relevant. And as our first speaker said, be brave. Go boldly forward into the unknown. Develop some of these novel and sui generis approaches and models. That's our competitive advantage in Aotearoa right now. We have a minister who wants to embrace Indigenous trade kaupapa. We applaud all the kupu around APEC. Make APEC more than just rehearsing the same old world trade agenda. Bring back trust. It's significant that APEC have issued their first joint communique in 3 years to call for free trade, free and predictable trade to help a global economy that's laid low by a coronavirus pandemic. My last comments are, I was kind of surprised that many of the pundits actually didn't pick that the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade would be Nanaia Mahuta. For us, she was the Associate Minister of Trade and Export Growth. She's been a top 10 person in the cabinet for a while. She's a Māori woman. It was actually sticking out like a sore thumb for us in the TFAB agenda. And I agree with the Minister when she said, Aotearoa has come of age. With this appointment and this worldview, I think she's more than her first narrative, more than just a woman, more than just a Māori or a politician. And I think with the Māori caucus saying, they said, we don't want their presence in cabinet as Māori to be news. And for us, we want the Māori agenda to be Aotearoa's agenda. This is the kaupapa for Te Taumata in partnership with MPAT and the government. APEC 2021 could and should help advance this. Seize the moment, be brave, kia koutou, katoa, kia kaha koutou katoa, ngā mihi kia koutou, mō koutou aroha I runga tēnei rōpu kua tai mai ki Wanganui o koutou. Kia ora.
Oh, awesome. Thank you for all those amazing insights. I'm just going to put it to the floor. We might have time for one or two questions. Yeah, does anyone have a question? There'll be a mic roving round. Kia ora.
Thanks. Seeing as there's only one question. Nā mihi nui kia koutou for doing the mahi to educate us and bringing your knowledge to us here. I used to work at MFAT. I don't work there anymore. I'm he ringa tohu Pākehī ki te whito tūhono aho, Asian New Zealand Foundation. I wondered if you could each give one piece of advice. I mean, Hone sort of gave like 40 minutes of advice. It was fantastic. But one piece of advice as to how young new MFATers can take forward their work on the basis of a true te tiriri partnership. What can they do in their own work? Thank you.
No visible on button. Maybe I'll just project then. Oh no, we don't want to be projecting. I don't think, I think it's a very difficult expectation to be thinking that young new graduates should be leading a treaty partnership. I think that leadership should come from the top, though that's where rangatira ki te rangatira, and then they'll be able to follow their leaders in those footsteps.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. I think that thinking needs to happen at the top.
Kia ora tautoko. I mean, I think one of the things to do is borrow from Māori. We have a concept of tōkana teina. And as the young, you're young, fresh, got a lot of energy, great ideas, good hair, you know, those sorts of things. And as the older, you've got wisdom, you're a little slower, less hair, yeah, greyer. But what the job of the young is to push those on the old, and the job of the old is to open up ways and avenues to hear the young and to give them space. So I think tōkana teina, think about that and take it on board in all the conversations you have. And kia kaha koutou.
Do we have any more questions? Cool. I've got one. Oh, okay. If we take it down to Vangelis.
I was going to make a comment if that was okay. So look, thank you very much, and thank you to Taria and Hone very generously mentioning me. I actually, so my observation is we're not there yet as an organisation. And I thought Felicity's question is a really good one. You know, what is it that the young can do? And I thought your answer was really good. Put pressure on us, put pressure on me. If I can give you a sense of, you know, I've been in the job now, getting into my near the end of my fourth year, and I am very conscious, and I had to appear in front of thank you, Professor Kelsey, in front of the Waitangi Tribunal a couple of weeks ago, and it was a real reminder, still got a way to go. I think the message, and I thought, you know, Professor Bargh and Dr. Kawharu, you gave us a lot to think about. I'd say I'm definitely up for that and for all of those things. My comment is our challenge is that our partners internationally are finding this hard. And that's a very polite way of saying they oppose us. That's not to say this isn't something we shouldn't do. That's to say that's part of the job. So my other comment is that we need to have a bit of a vision, and if I may say so, Māori also have a responsibility here to the First Nations in other countries. You are leaders. You actually are ahead of many others. And what I would like to do is to use our APEC year. So in APEC, we don't have, in a meaningful way, Indigenous issues on the agenda. We just don't. We have tried for nearly 3 years to get something on that agenda, and we've got sort of a hook now. Our challenge, I think, is to build a caucus within APEC so that not just in our year we do something, because we do have expectations, and poor Taria has got a lot to deliver there. And I'm certainly very committed to making sure something happens there. But what we need is something APEC adjacent with the handful of countries that are actually genuinely interested in working with us on this, so that we have a vision here that's not just about APEC 2021, but in 5 years and in 10 years and in 15 years, this becomes an accepted part of the discussion in APEC, because it's not at the moment. The overwhelming majority of members flatly refuse to have any conversation of this kind. So we don't give up. We're a country of persistent little buggers. And what we will do is we will run something alongside, and we're looking to work with, I don't know, yeah, he is here, our Canadian colleagues who are really supportive of us, of trying to do something, hopefully with the Australians and hopefully with 2 or 3 others. But that's where you can help us. You can help us by putting a bit of pressure on your counterparts, and you've got great networks internationally. Get them to lean in on their governments to participate with us in doing something APEC adjacent, but with a clear objective of bringing this into the APEC agenda. So we're looking to set up a caucus within APEC that covers Indigenous issues. And that caucus's objective will be to make this a mainstream, quote unquote, topic for us. There are all the important domestic things we need to focus on in the trade policy sphere, which I do acknowledge, and they are really, a lot of those are really challenging, and they do require a lot of consultation, a lot of engagement, and a lot of listening, and a lot of turning up. That's very true. Definitely up for that as well. I like the word that you use, several of you use the word pono. I can't resist. It's also a Greek word. But it has a different meaning. Surprise, surprise. So, as I understand it, it's about truth. In Greek, it means a particular type of pain, which I think is quite a nice way to think about it. It's a particular type of pain that's actually about longing, like something that's, you feel this pain, and it's actually for the Greeks in the diaspora, it's the longing, right? They can't go home, they're there, and it's the longing for something. And I'd like to think that that's the way we should think about this. There is a long-term plan here. There is a strategy. I'm not asking for patience, because why should you be patient? You should be pushing us. You should be putting pressure on us, right? There's a long way that us as an organisation have to move. But I can assure you we are very committed, and I am personally very committed, so that in 5 years, or even if it takes 10 years, it will be there in APEC, and it will be an accepted part of the way in which we think about trade policy in the future, that Indigenous issues are taken seriously in that sense.
Can I just add one thing, Evangelos, in this response? Thank you for that. I guess from a taumata perspective, though, we don't want Indigenous issues, we don't want Māori issues to be actually marginalised to it as an Indigenous thing. It is everything. All of the people that we are negotiating trade agreements with care about the environment, care about the future, care about a range of things that are important to us. We want to have participation in a range of those sorts of things as well. Kia ora.
Kia ora. We're just going to wrap up the session now, actually, just because we're going to morning tea very shortly, and there's a bunch of people online watching as well, so we'll try and keep to time. I just wanted to say, as Taria mentioned earlier, the Inclusive Trade Action Group is going to look to establish an Indigenous trade arrangement over the next year, and I look forward to seeing all your work continued into that conversation, I hope, and putting pressure on Vangelis to make sure that it's doing what Māori want it to do for us all. So with that, if we could all join together and thank our panel for their excellent insights this morning.
Kia ora. Please help yourself to morning tea, tea, coffee, toilet break if you need one. But can you please make sure you're seated again at 12 minutes past so that we can start the next session on time. Kia ora.